Okay, let's get into the specific memoirs. Where they're divided into 4 volumes. Each one starts with La Vita P. Vecchio, or translated into the older life, correct? And also subtitled The Meat Years 0 to 9. The second is La Vita Sono Shuta, also translated as The Unknown Life, subtitled The Steel Years 9 to 18. The third is La Vita Immaginata, translated to
The Imagined
Life, and subtitled The Dream Years 18 to 26. And then there's La Vita Nova, which comes from the Dante title, or The Changeling Years 26 to 38. Each of the memoirs as a whole, I think, is one of the greatest accomplishments in all of art. But one of the things I want to mention about each of them is that they may be speaking about a specific time period, but they drift in and out.
Yeah.
Theo Angelopoulos was a good example in how he did that. So that even though they're titled certain years, they drift into the future, they drift into the present. We'll speak about La Vita P. Vecchio in a moment. It concerns mostly your childhood, and the dominant character besides you, the 20th century, and your father is Ziggy.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about the opening moments because my father recently had a surgery, and it brought me back to the beginning of this book where the big toes of human beings rarely prefigured prominently in narratives or great tales or memoirs of major figures, and how your father's big toe kind of wiggles out. It's an interesting way to begin a novel. You also have some Vonnegutian sides in that Vonnegut would start by saying that you're going to begin reading this terrible book, but your remarks are far more pointed and knowing about how great the book is and where you'll be headed eventually, and it has even some spoilers attached to it of where you'll be going with it, only to kind of twist it later on. Let's talk about the first of the memoirs, the uniformity of it, and then we'll get into some specific tales.
Well, first off, it's not a novel. It's memoirs. I mean, the memoir form is different from the autobiographical form because it forces you to have to lie. Because 99% of the people that are named in there have different names. So, for example, if I say Peter Cleese is interviewing me via Skype, that's true and it's reality. But if I say, Joe Ishkabibble is interviewing me, it's not, because I don't want to mention your name. So the very form of a memoir gives you more play. That if I was writing a strict autobiography, I couldn't have done it this way. And I did it this way. I actually got about halfway into the first book and had some of the stuff online on websites that I'd sent around to, probably about 7 or 8 things. And a number of people who were used by name complained to me that they didn't want me to use it. They didn't say that I was lying about anything. One guy I went to school with said, he didn't want the fact that he had cancer as a kid being online. And I was like, Jesus fucking Christ. It's like, I had some issues with some people who had spent years lying about me that threatened to sue me when I confronted them with their lies online. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to get into that again. So I decided to change it, and all of the memoirs have the date that they were first written, 1504. And another important thing with all of these is I wrote them all in order. So, for example, the first memoir, the first book was written and completed before I did the second one. So I wanted to have each one and then go 7. So I didn't know where I was going throughout any of the books or the subsequent books that came after it, which is very different from. I don't think I'm ever going to write a sequel to the True Life books. And so this actually was about a year and a half. I didn't start this until about a year and a half after I left AT&T, and I had a job, and I left Minnesota for Texas after that. So there was some distance between them. But the important point again is when I write, for example, my short story manuscripts, I always do if I have 12 short stories in a manuscript, I'll write the first draft of each, and then I'll do the second draft. So I go wave by wave, and I write the 12. I write all of the stories in my short story manuscripts. they all flower at the same time. I didn't do that with here. Most people who write short stories, for example, will write would write a dozen short stories and work on that story until it's done. I don't, and the reason I don't, and it's why my short stories are better, and why my short story books are so great in that they mesh together, is because they are written at the same time and they all flower at the same time. I didn't want to do that specifically with the memoir because I wanted each of them to sort of be a nugget of a memory uh, by itself. So, uh, when I did the Big Toes one, I said that's my entree, and then let's see this. The next one was Boys, Cracks, and Spaces. That's when the girl who molested me, What Windows Allow, The Essence of Tyranny. So each of these, I would be like, well, what would come next? And I just sort of bobbed around in my mind, and I had lots of ideas floating around. Probably 4 or 5 of the memoirs that I did here were reworks of some essays that I did. For example, I did an essay a year or two before on Cosmoetica about this fat little kid I knew that I met at a supermarket in Minnesota who was silly stringing this woman. And it went back to my time when I was a kid, and me and this kid that I knew were throwing snowballs at a car, and this guy pulled out like a, a machine gun and put it together and threatened me. So that was a rework, but pretty much most of these ones were written there. And what I did though, at the end of the 4th book, then I went back and I compressed it, because originally the 4 books totaled, I think, about 780,000 words. So after all 4 of them was done, I compressed it and I edited the hell out of it. When I say edited, I went in each sentence and I took out unnecessary words. And I literally cut out about 140,000 words from the 4 books total. It went from about 780 to 640,000. So this is one of the most perfectly edited books that's ever lived.
The interesting thing is the addition of the poems, which we spoke about briefly too. It's interesting how you began with the Big Toes with the first knifing, Alone in the Heron Gallery, a Waste Sonata, and then George Schneider plays Handel in 1933. Now, the murder poems, the 13th murder poems, figure predominantly throughout the memoirs, and I think they're the only series, if I'm correct, that are given full view throughout your memoirs. All 13, I think.
Perhaps, yeah. I don't recall, but probably, yeah.
Then George Schneider plays Handball is also a comment on yourself and on your dad. And then it kind of drifts. But let's talk about the approach. You said about Ernest Hemingway, it kind of has a rat-a-tat-tat to. This is probably a better book than Hemingway could have ever written. It also
There's no probably about it. I don't need to be modded. There's no probably.
Kind of a slip of the tongue, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And the memoirs themselves are very stylistically different. Sometimes you'll be speaking about yourself, and there's also a great memoir called Inside of Ridgewood that gets into the mind of a young boy prostitute. And there's also some additional things that go past the uniform style of the first memoirs and change. The Essence of Tyranny is a good example.
Tyranny.
It has even more clipped. Yeah, Tyranny. It has even more clipped demarcations throughout it, and it slips in and out of time. Let me just pull it up here.
The interesting thing too is, and just so people know, is because we talked about the poems, and I think I mentioned it, the poems here in True Life are not the official poems that should be in my complete or collected poems. The poems that are in that PDF that William Glass had gotten out that have the real names of the real people, those are the official, actual versions of the poems. These are the memoired up using fake names where I needed to in the poems. And so sometimes a few of the poems, because the fake names are not as musical, because if I'm talking about Bobby Jones and I called him in the memoir, Billy Rutabaga, it's not going to have the same. So the poems here are not quite as good as they are in their original form, but that's just a concession made to having to change the names for the sake of a lot of bullshitters and pussies that didn't want to that we're fucking with.